Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise to speak on this matter of public importance today. And it's very interesting. We often hear from the member for Bendigo East blaming the opposition for its time in government when we've been in government for 4 of the last 20 years, but everything seems to be our fault. Speaker, it is a pleasure to speak on this issue. I went for a job as a cadet as well at the age of 17, and I was lucky enough to get mine, and spent 20 years in the media and 10 years as a country newspaper editor. I must say, when I got the MPI today from the member for Shepparton, it was interesting that we have an MPI at the state level that, as the first two speakers have pointed out, goes to the heart of, I guess, a federal regulatory regime. And we're talking about the Australian Broadcasting Act nationally. When we have a whole lot of issues in rural and regional Victoria at the moment, with businesses on their knees, we have, particularly in the areas of northern Victoria, we've got shortage of labour force, we've got one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the state, water security issues. You know, rural media is certainly very important, Speaker, and I'm not downgrading that. I just question whether it perhaps should be at the top of the list. But anyway, we'll get on with the discussion. Mr Speaker, having worked in the media for 2 decades, the rural media has suffered significantly over the COVID period. Like many other businesses have suffered over this COVID period. And working in that sector for 20 years gave me a great insight into the importance of country newspapers. It was therefore very pleasing that during this period of, I guess, this very tough economic period, and I'm surprised that the two leading speakers never raised this, but the federal coalition government actually established a specific fund to assist country media, which seems to have been overlooked. And this was the $50 million public interest news gathering program. And in my electorate alone, and my region alone, East Gippsland newspapers received $90,000 out of that fund to keep the doors open and support local journalism during the coronavirus pandemic. The Latrobe Valley Express received $205,000. The Gippsland Times more than $100,000. In the electronic media sphere, we had Win Television and regional newsrooms across Australia, including the one in Traralgon, received $4.5 million. And I'm assuming that this level of support was also afforded to media in northern Victoria and the Shepparton region as well, so I'm surprised that it never got a mention. So it's clear that the support from the federal coalition government was key in keeping a number of these rural and regional newspapers and media outlets afloat, and I've had that feedback given to me directly. But, Mr Speaker, despite that, the reality is that some have closed their doors. And when we talk about print media, we have had some that have had to cut back on the number of editions that they're publicising each week. And we only hope that they can recover, because I think everyone in this chamber would be in agreement that our country newspapers and country media outlets are very, very important. And one thing we can do to help save that and help get things functioning is to get the local economies operating again. Our newspapers rely heavily on advertising support to keep them going, and they rely heavily on local businesses to be operating profitably and then being able to advertise in their local papers. Now, as I said in this chamber yesterday, we can make some decisions now in relation to this COVID period that will help our local businesses and therefore help our local media outlets, because when we help one, we invariably help the other. And here are some examples of how we can help our local media through supporting our local business sector. At the moment, we can have 20 people in a church and we can have people in a cafe, but we can't have 20 people in a cinema. Makes no sense. Cinemas larger than churches, larger than cafes. We can't have 20 people in there, but we can have them in a church for a church service. If we change the rule to let our cinemas operate, they will start advertising in our local newspapers. Cinemas is one. We have some restaurants with only one room. Most restaurants have only one room. And we say we can have up to 40 people in hospitality. That's not true. It's a misrepresentation of the fact, because we've got a 10-person per limit. So restaurants aren't opening. The foreshore at Lakes Entrance is littered with restaurants. Whilst the Premier says we can have 40 in the restaurant, they can't, because they have one room, they can only have 10. Now, other states, other jurisdictions are operating under the 4 square metre rule, but we're not. Let's change that to operate how the other states are operating, very safely, without increasing the health risk, and they will start opening the doors and they will start advertising in our local newspapers. The same goes with pubs. 10 per room. They can't open the doors for 20 people. We need to have, a lot of pubs have just got a bistro and a bar. Let's move to the 4 square metre rule, get 40 in, the pubs open, they start advertising in the local newspapers. Not all newspapers and not all media outlets were going badly before COVID. One in particular in my electorate was growing quite significantly. They changed their model and they were growing. And it is a challenging time, as previous speakers have pointed out, in relation to social media getting into the market and people being drawn to that forum. But other media outlets have adjusted and were doing quite well. What we need to do now is change our COVID rules to get our economy functioning and get our newspapers back on their feet. I've got a ferry service operator in Lakes Entrance. He's got a massive boat. He's got 100 square metres of floor space on his boat. It's huge. He can have 10 patrons. Now, he's a big advertiser in our local paper. If we were able to work with businesses like that and allow them to open sensibly, we would have our newspapers receiving more advertising and being more profitable and getting back on their feet. It's this reduction in advertising revenue that has really hurt our country newspapers and media outlets. Now, Mr Speaker, for well over a century, country newspapers have been the lifeblood of many of our country towns. Television and radio are also critically important, particularly in the fire period and emergency situations that we have. They can report real time, whereas newspapers can't. But they all have their very important role in the community. The country newspaper, however, and I guess that's where my heart lies, in many cases has become the fabric and the backbone of a lot of country towns and a lot of country, communities. Not only to record the current news, but they've become a great recorder of history in those locations, where people can go back through the records of these papers and find out about all of the events of significance that have occurred in those particular townships. And on many occasions over recent times, we've seen a number of very important issues changed by local media. And the previous speaker from Bendigo East certainly touched on that. Typically, she pointed out some of the, issues that related to the coalition government, but conveniently overlooked a lot of the issues that have been raised in local media by this current government that have caused a lot of consternation in local communities. But, Speaker, country newspapers do play a critical role. The federal government has put its money on the table and offered significant support. It would be good if that was matched to the same level by the state government, because there are so many, and I'll just touch on for a few moments on why country papers are so critical. Many people of my generation bought their first home from their country newspaper. They bought their first car from their country newspaper. They catch up with all the local sport through their country newspaper. You announce the birth of your children to the community in the newspaper. Unfortunately and sadly, often the death of loved ones is announced to the community in your local newspaper. Our weddings announced in our local newspaper. Back in the day, the classifieds, the births, deaths and marriages, which were commonly referred to as the hatched, matched and dispatched by people in the newspaper game. But so critical in keeping our communities up to speed with everything that is going on, not just at a community level, but also at a personal level. They do play a critical role, Mr Speaker, country newspapers. I support the federal government's significant financial commitment to keep them going. It would be terrific if that was matched at the state level, but on top of that, we can make a lot of changes now in relation to our COVID restrictions that will help get our local media open and back on track.